if you're really into outdoor recreation, there's a lot of opportunity here, and it's very accessible, very easy to get to. That's something that I think more folks are coming to appreciate. And alligators. Alligators are very underappreciated in Huntsville. The recommendation, stay away. Stay away from the alligators, kids.
You mention alligators, you better mention Black Panthers too, apparently, right?
That's right. There's a return to the Panthers here. Yeah. Bears are making a comeback, which I'm...
Now, that I hadn't heard.
Oh, yeah.
Now, we spotted a bobcat in our neighborhood.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've got bobcats on ours, but there have been a couple, and again, I've only seen these online, so anything you see online, obviously take with a huge grain of salt, but someone in South Huntsville who was near the river got a small bear on her Ring Cam. It rang her doorbell while it was exploring the front porch.
Wow. Scary stuff.
They're just bears. They're cuddly, right? I've seen Disney movies. They're all friendly.
Hello, Huntsville. Hello, Huntsville.
Hello, Huntsville. Today we'll be talking about some of the wonderful neighborhoods that help make Huntsville such a wonderful place to live.
When I first moved here in the 1980s, it was a fun place to be, and it was a good place to raise a family.
Donna Castellano, the Historic Huntsville Foundation.
I've raised my son, my husband and I have a son, and so my son is a proud Huntsvillian. I enjoy the inclusiveness of this community. I enjoy that I think that Huntsville is a place that a lot of people feel like that they can come and feel at home and then begin to shape the city in their own image and participate. And then as I became involved with Historic Huntsville and got to know the history of our city, I realized that Huntsville has a history that it should be very proud of. And so I'm also attracted to the way that Huntsville evolved and sharing that history and preserving those stories and those sites. That's what I really have enjoyed about Huntsville over the past 15 years.
Okay, wonderful. So what neighborhood did you grow up in?
So I grew up in Birmingham.
Okay, great. So tell me a little bit now, like what neighborhood do you live in now?
I live in Twickenham. I live in the Twickenham Historic District. My husband bought our house in 1997. We didn't buy it for the neighborhood. We bought it because it actually was not in Twickenham at that time. It was a downtown neighborhood, and it was something that we could afford. We didn't have an awful lot of money, and our street was not in the Twickenham Historic District at that time. We were adjacent, but it was something that we could afford and something that we could live in. And I was attracted to the house more than I was to the neighborhood because it reminded me of my grandparents' house in Birmingham. It had a front porch, and it had taller ceilings, and it's a bungalow, so the molding and the characteristics of that house spoke to me like I could go back home again. And so the house was in good shape. It was not in excellent shape, but both my husband and I said, what the heck, if we don't like it, we can sell it. And we've been there for 25 years. It's a very special place for us.
So I grew up on the north side, northwest Huntsville. I grew up.
Grammy winner, celebrity producer, J.O. Johnson Jaguar, Alabama A&M Bulldog, Kelvin Wooten.
District 1. Well, District 1 now. I don't know if it was District 1 then, but it was District 1. Maston Lake, Tall Timbers, right across the street from what was known as Davis Hills Elementary and Middle School. Okay. Yeah, that's where I grew up.
Okay. What do you remember about that neighborhood?
Oh man, it was hot. I remember summers just being really, really hot. I remember first moving to that neighborhood. When my parents first, so just a little context, my parents first came to Huntsville. My dad worked for NASA, and we came here in 1980, and we stayed over on Morningside Drive off of Oakwood, okay, close to Progressive Union, Black Cigar Lounge in that area. And we stayed there for some years, so all the way up into second third grade, I started at Davis Hills, and that's when we moved over to Tall Timbers. That's that neighborhood I remember the most. And so it was hot. All the summers were hot. I remember when I was in middle school, I started playing tuba. I used to have to walk home from Davis Hills with the tuba around my neck, like I'm marching. But I was, they would let me take the tuba home. I wanted to practice when I want, taking it home. So I walked across the street with the tuba. It was great. I remember, this is not good, kids, but we would burn bugs with magnifying glasses and do all that kind of stuff. There was a big ditch in my backyard with a bunch of snakes, and I remember us trying to catch snakes, and it was just the kid. We would make little ramps on the curb with our skateboards and our bicycles and do all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah, it was it was pretty normal middle class childhood growing up in North Huntsville. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Tall Timbers was a neighborhood where I would say, for me as a black kid growing up then, the neighborhood was predominantly black. A lot of my dad's work buddies, lived in that neighborhood. So the representation there meant a lot just growing up, because I don't remember much from my previous neighborhood, but I remember going up there and just having all of my friends being black kids. And I remember all of us too trying to be musicians at the same time too. We were into all kinds of music. We were into the same music that all kids were into, a lot of rap music that I remember my mom hated that I tried to play. I remember playing Two Live Crew. I remember playing this stuff like really loud. She's like, "What in the world is this?" And they loved it when I became a musician and started listening to a lot of jazz. And I remember when JB came on the scene, that was like one of them things, like we used to stay tuned in to JB and every program, jazz and blues. We would sit and absorb all of that stuff. It was kind of around when I was in high school. But it's just a fun time. It's just a fun time. We were just innocent. We were just kids.
One of the things that we are starting to see
Dennis Maston, planning manager for the city of Huntsville.
is kind of a focus back on what had been the core of Huntsville, right? The old North Huntsville and South Huntsville neighborhoods. There's still a lot of growth out. There's still a lot of, new neighborhoods popping up kind of far out into Madison County and Limestone County. But I think you're seeing a renewed almost appreciation for some of the older neighborhoods that really kind of founded Huntsville. Not just the historic districts in town, but if you look at the kind of reinvestment and the new home purchases in areas like North Huntsville, really throughout North Huntsville, in South Huntsville, even in older neighborhoods that we didn't always know were there. There's actually some fairly old neighborhoods on the other side of the mountain, out in the Cove area. We always think of big big developments like Hampton Cove, but there are lots of little neighborhoods that are kind of tucked sort of on the apron of the mountains. And I think folks are finding kind of a renewed appreciation for living close to the core. And that's driving a lot of reinvestment in some of those neighborhoods. You see it in places that I guess had been traditionally called West Huntsville, Stove House and Campus 805, the old Butler High School, Low Mill, Lincoln Mill. You're seeing a lot of folks kind of moving into those areas, and you're starting to see an emphasis on kind of local investment in neighborhoods, that you're seeing creation of kind of small neighborhood nodes. The temptation is always to talk about downtown, right? But there are lessons from a downtown that apply to the rest of your community, creating almost small neighborhood centers or town centers that really help give every part of Huntsville its own kind of unique flavor.
So, Donna, can you tell me about these new historic neighborhoods in Huntsville?
Yes, so I'm really excited. One of the things that the National Register has a bar of significance for 50 years, which puts us smack dab in the middle of the space program. And so around 10 years ago, Historic Huntsville Foundation began looking at neighborhoods that were part of Huntsville space program. And that work was disparaged discouraged initially because they were all ranch houses. And it seems that there was a vote taken, and a lot of Huntsvillians decided that ranch houses weren't worthy of historic recognition, forgetting the fact that those were the houses that people lived in who took us to the moon. And I felt very energized by that, as you probably can see a little bit. So it became an issue of personal pride for me, is that Huntsville's going to have our state's first space age historic district. And so we began to work with the residents of McThorne-Moore Acres. Yes, of McThorne-Moore Acres, which is a neighborhood that's adjacent to UAH. And we went and talked with the residents, and they're like, how could you possibly think, we live in ranch houses, how could you possibly think our neighborhood is historic? And it's like, because what the people who lived in your ranch houses did was historic. Right. And so your neighborhood is historic by that. So we went from there, and then there is a neighborhood up next to Alabama A&M, Edmonton Heights, and it was established in the 1950s, and it was one of the first plotted subdivisions for black Huntsvillians. And at that time, there were black people coming into Huntsville to take part in the space age economy, and then the city of Huntsville had basically decimated a lot of black housing in the downtown area. So they had to have housing for black people, and this was a subdivision that was designated specifically for black people because we had segregation at that time. That neighborhood is now on the National Register. And then there is a second neighborhood, black neighborhood, that we're looking to have listed to the National Register. The city of Huntsville is working this. It's through the first phase, which is Magnolia Terrace. That neighborhood is adjacent to Pulaski Pike, and that is another black neighborhood that was established in the 1950s specifically for black residents. And we were instrumental in getting the city to look at that as well. In the core of that neighborhood is St. Joseph Catholic Church, which was the first school in the state of Alabama that was integrated. It was a black Catholic school, and they allowed white students in so that it could be integrated from that perspective.
Interesting.
Yes, yes.
Wow. So Magnolia, is that off of like University Drive and Pulaski and that little?
It's closer to Holmes Avenue.
Okay.
If you go down Holmes, it's in that area. There's 50s ranch houses there. There's also a house that's the centerpiece of that neighborhood that's referred to as the Drake House, and that was the former home of Harold Drake, who was the first black physician who had admitting privileges at Huntsville Hospital. So it's a 1900s colonial revivals type house, and it's a stunning feature. And it sets the age. That neighborhood actually was a transitional neighborhood. You had blacks and whites living together in that neighborhood. So it's interesting to see how those patterns have changed over the past 50 to 75 years. But it's going to be a great addition to Huntsville's historic resources to have those neighborhoods listed.
One of the things that we want to think about when we're talking about growth is it's not just necessarily the speed, it's how we're growing, what kind of quality we're putting on the ground. We've been very intentional about kind of improving our infrastructure, about improving our cultural offerings around music, about growing more parks and open space. I think we've been really prepping to grow for quite some time. Even well before I got here, there were planners who were working on how do we prepare for economic development? How do we prepare for this growth? And they put a lot of those plans in place, even before I moved from Atlanta. And I think the other part that I think folks can feel a little bit unsettling is sometimes you'll go through a period of really, really intense growth, kind of like we're going through now, and kind of like we went through in the 50s and 60s. When NASA landed at the Arsenal, it was incredible the amount of folks who moved here. My wife's parents moved here and had to wait something like 10 months for a house to be built. You couldn't find housing anywhere. So it's one of those things, as long as you're well prepared for it, as long as you've been thinking about it in advance, it take a little bit. It's like digesting a really large meal, but I think we're going to get through it because I think we have been doing the groundwork. We're ready for it. This was not a surprise for us, and I think it's going to result in an even better Huntsville in the coming years. In downtown Huntsville, there's definitely a balance between making sure you're preserving some of the historic neighborhoods and kind of accommodating the new development. The nice thing is we've already got kind of a pretty decent boundary drawn between them, but I think what you really see is kind of new quality of life and new restaurant options and new shopping options. And if you're living downtown, or you're living near downtown, all of a sudden you've got these whole new amenities that are popping up right next door. So what you're really seeing happening is a lot of those neighborhoods are becoming very expensive because they're right close to downtown. As a downtown becomes more popular and there becomes more to do downtown, more folks want to live close to downtown. So you're seeing a lot of older in-town neighborhoods that are seeing a lot of reinvestment because people are coming in and they're seeing them kind of with fresh eyes, and they appreciate them for what they are and not kind of what preconceived notions are there. But I also think you're seeing a lot of investment and interest in outlying communities, because you'll get people coming from, say, Atlanta or Northern Virginia who are used to spending 90 minutes in the car in the morning, and now here they can live in Owens Crossroads and still be in town in 20 minutes. And for them, that's fine. They're like, look, I can get a couple acres of rural farmland and still be at my job in less than half an hour. They consider that a win. So one of the things that is really interesting is how when people come in from outside a community and they're not carrying any sort of historic knowledge with them, they tend to look at things with fresh eyes, and they'll make decisions based really on that sort of new look at a place, and not necessarily on any kind of preconceived notions, which I think it kind of lends itself a fascinating dynamic.
So how many neighborhoods have you lived in?
In Huntsville, in the city of Huntsville, it was just those two neighborhoods.
Okay.
Stayed over, like I said, off of Morningside Drive. Stayed there for some years. One of my actually longest friends from high school, from that point on, my friend Kobe Williams. I remember Kobe. I don't know if I should mention his name, but Kobe we grew up across the street from me, and we graduated high school. I saw him in the neighborhood then. I think he went to Ed White, I went to Davis Hills, and I saw him again. He played in the band. He played trombone in the band. So that was my first neighborhood. Tall Timbers was the next neighborhood. And then my parents moved from there. They moved out to Harvest. Then after I left home, I moved to Harvest down the street from them. I couldn't move too far from my parents. I stayed about 5 minutes from my parents over in Harvest, over off Nick Davis. And then I moved to Athens,
Okay.
which I've been here since 2006.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why'd you select this location?
Well, for me, it seemed, as I was knowing more about myself and being introverted, I was like, yeah, man, the further I can get away from people, the better. And so back then, it wasn't as connected as it is now. So if you were living in Harvest then, it was like you were staying way out.
Right.
Like Harvest from Huntsville, you go up Douglas Road, man, you're in Harvest in no time. But back then, it just seemed so far because there was nothing in between. And Athens seemed even further. In this location now, my daughter was going to school in Decatur, and I forgot to mention I stayed in Tony for a year.
Okay.
And I was taking her to school to Tony, and it was just a long drive from Tony to Decatur, and I just couldn't find a short route. But I found a route just kind of that was weaving through that put me somewhere between Decatur and Athens, and I said, hey, and I wound up passing this home in Athens. I say, hey, this is a little bit in between. It's still far from everybody. It was for sale, and then it had a basement, which I had never saw in the city of Huntsville in this area. I said, it had a basement. And so I checked it out, and the basement was like completely empty. I said, oh yeah. So all my visions of putting a studio in the basement became a reality. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if it was one of those Prince type things. You know, he wanted his studio in Minneapolis because it's real cold to keep the bad people away.
Oh,
so I didn't
that is, I never knew that. But that is for certain. Yeah. Yeah. And I've been to Minneapolis. I've been to the Twin Cities, and it is cold. Yeah. But if anyone asks me where I'm from or where I stay, I always say Huntsville, because they don't have unless you're from Athens or from this area, you don't really know.
Right. Right.
Athens or
Right.
Tony or Meridianville, you know of Huntsville.
Right.
Yeah.
What would you say would be your favorite Huntsville neighborhood?
My favorite Huntsville neighborhood?
Yes.
Wow. That's a really, really good question. You know, a lot of things look good neighborhoods look great when you don't stay in them. You know, they look good from afar, but then you're in the neighborhood. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I do say this, I often drive up, this is a corner intersection of Drake and Whitesburg.
Okay.
So there's Central Adventist SDA Church right there on the corner.
Okay.
You just drive Drake all the way until it just runs out.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite neighborhoods. I remember in the 90s when I was a kid, I used to have a Ford Probe. I used to ride up after church and ride up in the neighborhoods. I said, man, I want to stay up here. You know, you could really see the city really, really well. You could see the whole city, and I still drive up there just for the nostalgia of just driving. I actually like where I'm staying, but that's one of my favorite neighborhoods.
Hello Huntsville is hosted by Cynthia Joyner. Cynthia Joyner and Jeff Morlock are the executive producers. This podcast is produced and directed by Keith Matthews and David Person. Jake Martin and Hans Guger provided remote and in-studio audio engineering and other technical support. Chad Bell is the production administrator. The podcast theme was written and produced by Kyle Wimbish and David Person. Spread the word about Hello Huntsville, the first podcast that makes Huntsville, Alabama, the star.